Welcome, Zoomers, welcome. in
Boomers.
person.
Yeah.
Boomers on Zoom.
Some boomers.
I would like to introduce Martin Grace. He is, I call him authentic German because he was born and raised
Right.
in Germany.
Yeah.
And you probably tell us a little bit more
I
about
can,
that.
I can.
And he also wears many hats out at Concordia Language Village.
Yes.
And you can tell us a little bit more about that as well.
Sure.
That'd be awesome.
Okay, sounds
Okay,
good.
thank you.
Well, it's good to be here and welcome to the third series of our adult education piece on Martin Luther and things around Martin Luther. Today, maybe it's a little less specific about him, more about the, like the lay of the land of where he lived and worked and what he did. But like Becky said, I grew up in Germany, in the southwest area of Germany, by Stuttgart. Can you guys on Zoom hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, wonderful.
Can you show us on the map?
I can show, I'll have maps.
Oh, okay,
It's all
great.
about geography. There's lots of maps today. And I will, but it's the southwest corner of Germany, kind of, let's see, just above Lake Constance,
Okay.
by Stuttgart. A small village that nobody would know, but Tübingen is a close by town, and that's well known for its theology study program, actually. Theologian by the name of Jung was very active there, right? Did you want to add anything else about that? Okay, all right. Don't want to go down too many tangents. But I moved to Grand Forks, North Dakota when I was 16, and then somehow I ended up connected to Concordia Language Villages through the German class at Red River High School.
Okay.
And that's what drew me in 1978, probably. And then I've been working at Concordia full-time since 1995, and in Bemidji since 97. So different roles with Concordia over time, operations at first, and now more in program oversight. Currently, specifically with programs that Concordia Language Villages is doing with Department of Defense personnel. So, but not to get into that.
He's just getting started, totally.
Come on in. Yeah.
All right.
So the focus today is a little bit more about geography and Luther, but also Germany in general. And so here's a little kind of just activity to start with, and just to yourself, jot down what you know. And there won't be a quiz. You won't get extra. Well, you could get extra, I guess, if you know all the answers to everything. But just kind of on your own, just kind of write down what you know about these. What you can think of, just to kind of get your mind into this yourself. And we'll get back to it at the end. I won't necessarily. Thank you.
Will there be a quiz?
There won't be a quiz.
Okay.
Just a minute or so. You don't have to answer all of them. You can bounce around.
What was the name of the city you said you grew up in?
Altenburg, or Tübingen. is like this. That's right. I dropped some hints already. I dropped some. No, not much. I can see that. I can sit, stand.
How many states are there?
That's a good question.
Oh, I don't know. Okay.
I'll tell you, there's 16 states.
Oh,
Mhm.
Wow.
no idea.
Mm-hmm. 11 states in what used to be West Germany and 5 in what used to be East Germany. Mhm.
This is why I never played Trivial Pursuit.
Well, this ties into a game we used to play as kids in Germany at birthday parties and things called Stadt, Land, Fluss, city, land, and river. And where you have these categories, you can add names and mountain ranges and capitals, whatever. And then somebody find that, kind of goes through the alphabet in their head and somebody else says stop and whatever letter they're at, let's say it's M, then you have to think of cities, countries, rivers, mountain ranges, names, whatever, colors with that letter. Anyway, so. It's a very German birthday game, isn't it? Not really fun.
I love geography, so it's super fun for me, but yeah, for the common small German child.
All right. You can keep writing if you want to, but we'll keep going if you want to go to the next slide. And we'll tie a little bit into the last couple of presentations by Don Carlson and Lisa. Ready for? Similar last name. Just to get, so this is a map of Europe around 1500. So Martin Luther would have been what, 17 years old? 1483?
83, yeah.
1483, that's what I thought. We see kind of the Holy Roman Empire, obviously, and as we talked about that quite a bit, and all the neighboring kind of empires or states, countries. And you'll see some names already that will look familiar in terms of Bohemia, Bavaria, Württemberg, giving some hints here on states of Germany, Brandenburg, that will pop up in later maps. But just to kind of give a reference of how the next few maps will kind of go through, just kind of bring us to the point of where we are today. But this is the map of the time around Martin Luther kind of becoming active in 1500 or 1501, I think, is when he started his studies in Erfurt, one of the cities in Germany. Hint, no, just kidding.
There was no Netherlands, there was no Belgium, there was no
exactly, yeah.
way into the top of Italy.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Plus, I mean, one of the things a colleague of mine, Concordia, pointed out with this whole war in Ukraine this spring at a presentation he did, is that, Europeans are used to maps and territory changing hands, right, over time. And what is now Ukraine hasn't always been Ukraine. Right? You see Crimea is separate from what is labeled as Ukraine on the map here, for example. Yeah. So, and there's no access by Ukraine to the Black Sea. In this case.
And the Ottoman Empire is what was very threatening.
On the bottom.
On the very bottom.
Oh,
the
yeah.
dark red.
Yep.
Is and that was one of the things that Luther wrote against, because they're this Islamic state and they were kind of pushing up into Europe. So you can see how that's coming into Hungary and moving up, getting more land for the Ottoman Empire. Yeah.
And if you go to the next slide, Becky, please. It's a map of predominant religions in the mid-16th century, so right around Luther's death, right? So he died in 1546. That's the right date?
1546.
All right. The legend on the left gives you a sense of the different religions. Catholicism obviously was still very dominant, and you can kind of see where the Lutheran gray, lighter white almost area is at that time. So right toward the end, and there are still obviously pockets of different religions within that larger each of those segments. So not all purple is necessarily, well, it says mixed actually, Poland, Lithuania, that area. And then you can see in France, the shaded area were primarily Catholic, but also some Calvinists blended into that area. And you'll see on the map later, it's kind of a little bit of a side topic map where the Catholics are in Germany still today. Anyway, we'll go ahead to the next slide, unless anybody has any questions. Then we've also talked a lot about how the states and the areas that were ruled by princes or dukes or imperial cities in the Roman Empire were all these little principalities. So this is really how it was broken up around 1500. So there is no Germany per se, as we've talked about before. It's all these little principalities, and they were tied together administratively through the Holy Roman Empire. But of course, so then traveling, when Luther goes down to Rome and everywhere else he had to go for his different, for the hearings, for the diets he had to attend, was mostly by foot. So when he was, in Erfurt around 1510, he actually essentially went by foot down to Rome. There obviously were horses and things as well, but a big chunk of it was, and there might have been, I don't know, but there might have been some rivers that, they were able to get on as well. But a lot of it was by foot, and it took quite a while. So the idea of getting around and just going over to Worms or to Augsburg, where he was at those respective times, isn't just like a weekend trip real quick. Quite a bit of effort. And when he went to Rome, he was more of a, on his own. He wasn't as well known yet by 1510. He hadn't posted a thesis yet. So then, but later he had more of an entourage, more of a group that traveled with him. And so there could be taxes that you have to pay in order to cross one principality to another principality. There could be other things that you have to give up or, share. So it might be, it's not that easy to get around.
Was there a common coin or currency?
That's a good question. No. Probably not. Way of payment? No.
Okay.
Yeah. So again, it ties in what Lisa talked about last week in terms of some of the history. Things were quite much more difficult in terms of being able to get around and understand and building those relationships. Later after he had posted a thesis that was more well known, I'm sure there was maybe in some ways easier passage and in some ways more difficult depending how people viewed him, right? The other thing then along with these, that's looking ahead to the next slide, which is good. So the other thing that goes along, so each of these principalities, of course, they had their own, so that's why there are, in many ways, are so many castles in Germany, right? Because each ruler had their own residence, more or less. And so in German, there's two different words for castles. There's a Schloss, which is more than SCHLOSS, or a Burg, BURG. And the Burg is much more of a fortress kind of, for defending and for, keeping holding territory or attacking other territory, but more of a fortress essentially, where a Schloss is more of a castle residence that we think of.
Okay.
Yeah. So Wartburg, B-U-R-G, really is more of a fortress when it was first built. And it was built around the year 1000, I think, the first, around that time. So much older than Luther's times. And there's a couple different stories. There's a German word Warte, W-A-R-T-E, which is like, now I'm losing it, that's lost the word. A guard tower, kind of a watchtower, or that kind of a structure at least. So a lookout. And then there's also a story about how this landowner from another area was hiking along and saw this beautiful hilltop and said, Warte, so wait, Berg, mountain, wait, mountain, I want to live here, kind of thing. And so Wartburg, wait, Burg turned into Berg. It's a story, but probably isn't true, but it's out there online and elsewhere as well, kind of thing. So, and then this guy, because he can't build on somebody else's property, brought, obviously not dump trucks, but somehow brought dirt onto this mountain from his own property, and then it was his property, so he could build this fortress there. So, yeah, and that part of the story I think is true.
Wonder how they moved
Right.
materials and things around.
It took pretty much a lifetime probably.
Are there
And yeah.
pilgrimages in Germany along any of these paths?
Absolutely, yes. Actually, we were in Germany and in Czech Republic when we were there this spring. We saw the Camino de Santiago, the trail, a sign for that trail that people pilgrim from France, southern France into Portugal. And there were trails that fed into that from other countries as well. Yeah. Anything else you want to add to
Well, part of the whole, I think one of Luther's tenets, and one of the things that maybe was kind of would have bothered him a little bit was the fact that they was the practice of using relics to create pilgrimage sites. So for example, in Cologne, the Cologne Cathedral claims to have the bodies of the three kings that visited Jesus when he was a baby, right? So the pilgrimage sites were often things that it was very competitive. A lot of cities worked very hard to get relics from the Holy Land, and that's part of what sort of fed some of the Crusades. The Crusades were about, had a theological thing, they're going to go and win back, land from the infidels, but they also turned out to be both economic and political too as well, because they were able to get these relics. Now, I mean, were they really relics or not? We don't know, but you'll see them all over Europe, well, especially in Germany and German areas, because if you were able to get a relic that could be, could be a place of veneration for people, for pilgrims to come through. Pilgrims will bring you a lot of money, commerce into your area, and the different monasteries and churches that had sponsored these relics and had pilgrims coming through. Obviously, that was kind of an economic boom. So that was another kind of aspect of Catholicism that was very prevalent at this time. People, if you're thinking about what Don talked about that first session about the theology of doing all those different sacraments and climbing that ladder and having that, having enough money to be able to take a pilgrimage in the first place, and then being able to go to these sites and get blessed and whatever by that particular saint. All of that fed into what Catholicism was kind of putting out there as theologically sound, which Luther had problems with. He had problems with the idea that you needed to do all those kind of works, pilgrimages and different, that would to get you climb the ladder up into heaven. So this was an interesting aspect of Luther's life and what he would. I'm sure everybody pretty much took it at face value. That's what you would need to do to get there. So that's one of the things that the question of pilgrimages and the fact that people would walk these longer pilgrimages, and they exist today. People do walk the community.
I was probably used the wrong word. Maybe I meant a reflective walk.
Well, and that's what people, that's the same. No, that's the right walk. That's the right word. People
But I
do
mean
use it.
modern.
Yeah, people do still do that. They still take it as, they don't necessarily use it as visiting a relic or visiting a church for a particular, to be healed or whatever people used to do it. But they do still do it as a reflective practice. You'll still see people in Rome, on their knees going up steps and stuff just for different reasons. But yeah, as a reflection. So, yeah.
Weren't the pilgrimages tied in somewhat to the indulgences as well?
Well, yeah,
Like
that
part of the way
yeah.
that you could get them.
It's one of those there's many, there were a lot of, and this was part of the theology that bothered Luther at the time that Catholicism had sanctioned, were these things that people could do, buy indulgences, go on a longer pilgrimage, wear scapula. Well, there's a lot of different things that's part of that. So, sorry, go ahead, Mark.
No. We go to the next slide then. This is today's kind of area around Mansfeld where he was born, right? There's all the little castles, all those little red spots can illustrate. And obviously, anything with a V or a G word is a little bit on higher ground because it's more of a fortress, more of a lookout, more of a, to defend and look out for the enemy. And actually, if they infringe on your space, and the Schloss are more the residential elements again. But these are all within an hour of where he was born. So that's, when we go on the trip, we'll have a chance to see castles because they're everywhere.
Where is the town that he was born in?
Mansfeld, so it says Martin Luther's
born in
death house and birth house.
But he was born in
Just below
Iceland.
that, it says,
Oh, I didn't.
well, he was born in Mansfeld, and then he was it Iceland?
Yeah, Iceland.
Well, it says it's, okay.
And then, but Mansfeld is right there. It's part of, Iceland was a part of the duchy or whatever of Mansfeld. So Mansfeld and Iceland are right near each other. And then Mansfeld, they moved to when he was very young. So he grew up in Mansfeld, more or less. Yeah. So I think that's where his, the house is, where they lived and they had the, yeah.
Within half an hour of each other.
Yeah.
And then the next we'll go back to the Holy Roman Empire. Next slide. And this is about, now 150 years roughly later. So you can start seeing a little bit of a consolidation of spaces. That's really all I meant to show here, is that it's becoming less fractured. If we go to the next page, then this is another 150 years later, roughly 200 years later, almost. The German Confederation, and this is right before, in 1871, Germany appeared for the first time as a country. So this is still not, there's still no Germany. There is the Prussian, Kingdom of Prussia, the Bavaria, of Austria, Württemberg, all these different kings and ruling different parts of what is today Germany.
So is this still considered the Holy Roman Empire?
It's called the German Confederation.
So that's
Yeah.
okay.
1806 is when with the Napoleonic Wars, that's when that was the end of the actual Holy Roman Empire. But the Confederation kind of started to build, and then finally with Otto von Bismarck. I think you're going to talk about it next, right? Yeah.
I won't talk about him much, but that's the next step in terms of German map development, essentially, and that's the next slide, actually, where you can. Yes.
Did Germany come into existence then in the 18? I mean,
Yes.
you read about things that like Luther's something or other was translated into German in 1500. So German was a language,
Yes.
but there was no Germany.
Right.
Okay.
Germany was this loose confederation of states. Well, it wasn't loose. It was actually, there was a confederation of these tiny little states that all had a common language, and that's what pulled them together.
And so Bismarck, Otto von Bismarck, was the first chancellor, or in Germany, the president is a figurehead kind of position. It's not an elected position by the people. It's elected by the parliament, actually. But the chancellor is really the governing figure within the German administrative system. And so Otto von Bismarck, capital of North Dakota is Bismarck, right?
For political reasons,
Yeah.
to attract German immigrants.
Right, and which worked, right?
Yes. It's a German triangle.
Yeah.
Right.
Dakota.
What other cities are part of that triangle?
Well, it's kind of from Bismarck and south and east. If you just put dots on the map of where German or Norwegian immigrants are, there's a triangle,
Right,
kind of from Bismarck and then south and east, pretty much.
right.
And it's very interesting because German Lutheran churches are very different than Norwegian Lutheran churches. My job was assistant to the bishop.
Okay.
And when you have a pastor who moves from a Norwegian church to a German church, I needed to have a coffee with him and tell him, no, this is.
This is going to be a little
Luckily both drank coffee.
Well, some of them had to get used to drinking beer.
Well, there's that.
I'll tell you one quick story. I had a phone call from a pastor who had just moved from a Norwegian church to a German church. And my job was pastoral placement, one other thing. And he called me up and says, Ron, you got to get me out of here. This is a mismatch. I said, oh, what happened? Well, he says, well, we had my first church council meeting last night. The chairman of the church council said, Pastor, that was the worst sermon I ever heard. I said, not to worry, it's over. He told you what he wanted to tell you. That's it. If this has been a Norwegian church,
Right.
he would have been in big trouble. But the German culture, you put it out there,
Yeah.
and it's over.
Yeah. Very direct. No beating around the bush.
But Bismarck was named to attract German immigrants, no question.
So that's a hallmark of German culture, is to be pretty direct.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Like-
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You should experience it.
I thought,
Yeah, I experienced a lot, but,
No, we're against totally to be indirect.
yeah.
Right.
So doing shopping, like for clothes in Germany, I'll be like, oh, I think that would, I'd like that shirt, but the proprietress, the person who's the saleswoman might look at it and go like, oh, no, that would be the wrong color for you. I'm like, I'm the customer.
Well, she'll tell you, you look fat in this.
I would go with it, you just have to get used to it. It's not- And they don't mean it in a mean way, and it's done. They don't
No.
harp on it. They don't go over it.
It's been helpful.
Yeah, it's just a cultural difference. And it's just the way it is. Yeah. They don't mean it in a mean way at all.
So is that why Luther was so direct? I mean, he was pretty direct, like,
Yeah.
Yeah, possibly.
yeah, part of that was his cultural.
Definitely.
Between that and his year of studying law or something. To be an arguer. Yeah.
So quickly moving then from 1871 to 1945, essentially. So this is the first time Germany really appears as a country. Of course, the end date of the empire is at the end of World War I. You'll note that on that map, the previous one still, which of course the end of World War I. So then we know that World War II happened, and then so going closer to today's Germany after the war, right after Germany lost the war, essentially. The Allied powers, so Russia, Great Britain, France, and the US, divided up the territory that they collectively, I guess, were ruling over at the time. And so what was the Russian or Soviet area became East Germany. So that's actually, if you look at the map, and we'll see that in the next slide, but not yet. You'll see that actually most of where Luther did his work and studied and lived and was born is actually what was at the time East Germany. Now it's Eastern Germany. So so when we go there on the trip, that is part of the backdrop a little bit in terms of just this culture and society. It's a little bit different still, even after what is it in 1990, so 32 years. There's still generations alive who were under East German communist rule. Yeah.
How is it different? Or like this little tidbit, like what?
Both East Germany and West Germany within their respective blocks, so the Western Bloc, right there, and the Eastern Bloc, Soviet Union, all the Eastern European countries, were part of the economic powerhouse or a powerhouse within each of those two blocks. So the German kind of, maybe I'm being stereotypical here, but the industriousness and work ethic and all that was prevalent everywhere. I think partly because ownership of material things wasn't as valued in communism, right? It's all property was owned by the state and by collectively. Some of the buildings and just weren't kept up as well, especially religious kind of facilities, right? Because religion is not a part of communist philosophy, or it's not. And so that's one piece. And in communism, they have these, or at least at the time, they had these 5-year plans where, for 5 years, they'll make one car of this color, right? And so you had to put your order in, and sometimes it would take 7 years. So you might get a different color than you used to. And so the idea of all the options and are still overwhelming when you go to the supermarket to people, older people, especially from East Germany. Right? So those are the kind of things. If you would go to a restaurant, again, part of the plan is to have pork and these 3 dishes with pork for these next 2 weeks, whatever. And so you'd see a menu in a restaurant and you choose something that you think you want to eat, and that's not available today. We're out of that. The next thing, not available. Next thing, not available. Well, what do you have? Well, we have this dish today. It's like, why do you have a menu? Just things like that. And so some of that, I think, like I have a cousin my age essentially who tried even tried to the entrepreneurial thing and opened his own pharmacy. He was a pharmacist in East Germany, and dealing with money and that you're responsible for your own success in terms of business versus it being in Germany. In East Germany, there was a right to have a job, so everybody had a job. There was no unemployment. Your job may be pushing the button on the elevator, but you had a job. That's what you did 8 hours a day. You got paid by the state, those kind of things. So that you were taken care of. You had insurance, you had all those kind of things. But versus having to, in a way, work for it and there being class difference. There was a class difference, but much. The upper class was the ruling class.
They didn't like to think that there was.
Right,
There
yeah.
was a class difference,
Right.
especially if you were a party member or not.
So the idea, so he's gone bankrupt 2 or 3 times because he just can't quite figure out how to handle the money piece, right? And so he was in his early 30s, right around 30, when the wall came down and Germany unified. And so that was a very different, that's the peak of his career in some ways, right? For most of us at 30 were kind of for the beginning of a professional career. And so that was a big switch for him because he had been trained and raised differently. So anyway, so then the Great Britain, French, and US sectors essentially became West Germany. And the same for kind of Berlin was divided in the same way. So West Berlin was ruled by Great Britain, France, and the United States, and East Berlin essentially was the capital of East Germany.
Why did they decide to divide the city that is in the middle of the communist state into 2 halves?
Historically, I don't actually quite know how that all came to be, but
I think the whole idea was that the 3 allies that made up the western side already in like there was a lot of negotiating. When are we going to give this back? They were very cautious about Germany kind of as a whole. And one of the things that was discussed, I think, for the division of Berlin was that it would be a deterrent for the Soviet bloc to keep their area. The Soviet Union had actually paid the biggest cost for this in humanity, human-wise. They had, because of the siege in Stalingrad and stuff, they had lost a lot of citizens, a lot of stuff up in the Soviet Union. And I think they had a different attitude towards what they should do as victors compared to the 3 other allies. They felt like they needed to kind of punish the German people a little bit more. Like they moved whole factories out of East Germany over to Russia as kind of compensation for the war. On the Western side, with the Marshall Plan, the Western allies started pumping in a lot more. The United States was really the only country that had any kind of economic stability at the time. So they started pumping in money into their sector and were able to work with the British and the French. Interestingly enough, Austria was also divided, and so was Vienna. Vienna was also divided into 3 or 4 sections as well. Vienna itself was, but was turned over to the Austrians fairly early after the war. But you can still see remnants of where the Soviet part of Vienna existed. They love these monumental sculptures and stuff. So anyway, so that was sort of, I think it was mostly as a deterrent to keep, to try to keep Germany as a whole from just becoming divided, but it didn't really work. They tried to siege the Soviet bloc, tried to keep Berlin. They wanted the Allies to leave Berlin, and so they had a big siege. They kind of blockaded Berlin, the Berlin blockade, and the Allies supported the city for many, many months through an airlift of bringing in all food, all fuel, all kinds of stuff that the city needed. So the 3 sections in Berlin were sustained by the Berlin airlift in the 1950s. So they did try to kick out the Westerners at one point, but it just didn't work. So it remained divided for 40 years then?
not quite, 49 to
40, yeah.
30 years old.
Well, the wall went up in Berlin in 1960.
40 years, right.
So 40 years ago. Or 30 years and then, but 40 years total without the wall for 10,
And Berlin was the capital of Germany before the war, right? So I think the idea of giving up the capital, even though for West Germany, the capital moved to a different place. They didn't have it in Berlin. But in order to get, this is a little tangent now, but in order to get to West Berlin, East Germany had 3 approved transit routes that you could take, and you could not leave that route on your way to Berlin because you didn't have a visa to get into East Germany. So there were gas stations on that route, and they would keep track of how long it would take you to get from whatever, when you left West Germany to when you get to Berlin. And if you took too long, then it was suspicious.
And what was the capital of West Germany?
Bonn, B-O-N-N, which is north of Cologne, right? No, it's the south of Cologne, right there. B-O-N. And then, when Germany unified, it became Berlin again. So then the next picture gives you a sense of East-West Germany, which we just talked about, and you'll see, Erfurt, one of the cities where they studied it, was in the monastery for a long time, for 10 years or so roughly. And Leipzig is there. So that whole area, and where he was born was north of, a little bit north of Leipzig, to the west. So definitely what is now East Germany. Not that mattered in his day, right? Because it was a very different state.
In East Germany, I see Karl Marx stopped.
Right?
Was that name changed? when you
Yes.
unified?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's Chemnitz, I think. Isn't it Chemnitz?
It went back to its, yeah,
Karl Marx was what was named after under the Soviet
Soviet rule.
rule. Yeah.
Scott means what?
City.
City.
Okay. Mark City.
Mhm.
And he wasn't actually from that city, so
No.
Karl Marx is from Trier, which is way over in the west. So.
South and west of Bonn, actually.
Yeah.
If you look at the map. Yeah. All right, and then you see all kinds of, so then you can, on the right half of the map, well, there we can go to the next slide, and then you get to your 16 states right there. And I highlighted the ones in light yellow where the ones we'll be in as part of the trip. There we go. And so just in general terms, Germany is about the size, square miles or kilometer wise, as Montana, and has the size of population of Texas. So much, and Texas is about twice the size of Montana. So much more densely populated than, between East and West Germany. So today's Germany is about 80 million people. Then just to get a little bit more into other geography, the next slide shows, we always don't think of the Alps essentially as as the mountains in Germany, but there are other lower and mid-level kind of mountain ranges, and Germans love their forests, of course, as well. So as you can see, the southern half is much more as variation in terrain, not as more or less flat as northern Germany, as you get toward the Alps. So one of the right toward the border with the Czech Republic, above Prague, the upper left is the Ore Mountains or Erzgebirge, which is was part of East Germany at one point, but it's also a really well-known kind of wood handcrafts area that we'll hopefully do a day trip to for those who want to from Leipzig once we're there on the trip. And so the other really well-known mountain range is Harz, which is pretty much right in the middle, H-A-R-Z, right there, exactly. And beautiful architecture, and it's one of those kind of quintessential German looks beyond what we find in southern Germany.
When he was,
Other thing I think on this map is probably easiest to see. So you want to ask a question first?
I was just gonna, it just made me think of when Martin Luther was going around,
Right,
he had a lot of terrain to get through.
Right.
Like,
right,
if he was walking,
right.
it just kind of baffles me how.
Well,
they did that.
you can see a little bit how some of the rivers work. So, you could be on a river a little bit, but then you'd have to.
And, right down where below Munich, where the Bavarian Alps, that's where Mittenwald is. So that's where you kind of hike through the Alps. Mittenwald is, and which is going to be part of the trip as well toward the end of our trip. Hiking for a day. But I think allegedly spent a night there on his way back from Rome. So this is also a good place where you kind of see the rivers, and Germany has access to the North Sea. which has access to the Atlantic, right? So in the north, you see some major spots for transportation over by sea. What is that? Shipping. Hamburg is a big one. Bremen. Is Bremen on the map?
Yep.
Yeah, Bremen and Wilhelmshaven. Those are also in the kind of the upper left corner of Germany. And then you can see the rivers that also tie into those harbors. Really, you can navigate all the way down into Austria, Czech Republic by ship, and a lot of that kind of trade happens that way, or at least it still does. A lot of it is by train today as well. But and then in Germany, you can see there's a bunch of canals that kind of also tie big rivers together to help navigate and enhance that transportation network. There's one spot, was it Weser, and what else? What was the other river? Where there are two canals that go over each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's near where is that? Near Osnabrück, where it says Weser, Münster, in that area.
Must be the M's.
Ems and Weser, yeah.
Is that down here?
Up by above
Like
Dortmund, you see
Netherlands.
where it says Weser, W-E-S-E-R, to the right there a little bit.
Oh, okay.
And then, the next is a map of just, kind of showing the distance you traveled there. You had to go to Rome. And I did a Google map, so it shows us the whole trip in kilometers and how many hours it would take by car, which of course didn't exist. But it's quite the haul, as we said before. I think that trip in 1510 was more of a pilgrimage kind of trip. Right?
Yeah, I mean, he was still pretty young
Right.
then, and, yeah,
27. Yeah.
he was 20, so yeah.
And then the next slide is ties a little more into ours. Where we will prepare kind of the turf that we'll cover in some of the key cities.
So you'll fly into Frankfurt?
We'll fly to Frankfurt,
And then make the
go
walk.
up to Eisleben, and then to Leipzig, and from Leipzig do a couple of trips like to Wittenberg, and then and to Thurgau, to the east of Leipzig, which I didn't put in here. In Google Maps, you only can put in 10 different stops, I think. So I had to choose strategically which ones to put in. And then we'll go over to Wartburg, to Erfurt and Wartburg Castle, before heading south to Nuremberg, and on the way to Nuremberg, we'll stop in Coburg, which is another Luther kind of place. And then on the way to from Nuremberg down to Mittenwald, we'll stop in Augsburg. And then we head over to Worms. By our single, besides the first day, that last trip to Worms from Mittenwald is probably the longest. The other thing, once we're down by Mittenwald, there's, Neuschwanstein, very famous castle, the Disney castle. And actually the Wartburg was used, some parts of the Wartburg were used as a model by Ludwig. Is he a prince?
No, he's a König, right?
King
Byron?
Ludwig, that's
Oh
right,
my
that's right, the
gosh.
Bavarian King Ludwig.
Yeah.
When he built the Neuschwanstein, he had he had been to Wartburg and used some of those rooms as examples for his castle. Then, just because it's all about Luther, but there's also on the next slide, there's a bunch of other points of interest in various cities, and I just wanted to highlight some of those. So along the trip, we'll experience that as well in terms of Eisenach, and there's a little Johann Sebastian Bach museum. There's a Luther museum there too, of course. So we'll see that the church where St. Georgskirche, I think, where Bach's parents maybe played.
Well, there was a whole
That's a
generation of Bachs that were musicians there, but, and in
Okay.
Eisenach was where Luther went to elementary school.
And in Leipzig, and we'll spend a few days there. It's hopefully, the schedule isn't out yet for some of those kind of concert opportunities, but hopefully we'll get a chance to take a few things in, cultural things in Leipzig. It's quite it's the biggest city we'll be going to, per se. Also important for Luther, but at the Nikolaikirche Kirche is they had, during East German times, right? They had these peace gathered or prayer gatherings. They were allowed, often was just 10, 12, 15 people. It's a big church. But they somehow started, as with Gorbachev coming on, right, as the president of the Soviet Union at the time, and kind of talking about glasnost, opening up things a little bit. People were in East Germany were encouraged. And so these prayer meetings would get bigger and bigger and bigger until they couldn't fit into the church. They went into the streets. And then every Monday for maybe 16 weeks were these demonstrations. And they got bigger each time, spilled into other cities. And then that's how essentially the Velvet or peaceful revolution happened. And eventually the wall came down.
Never did a church.
Yeah. And then Leipzig is also a big cultural center for other artists, musicians, writers that are well known in Germany and beyond. And just from a Graefe, indirect Graefe family connection in Leipzig, there is one of I think maybe one of the oldest coffee houses in Europe. That's
Kaffeebaum?
Kaffeebaum, that's right. That from the 1700s or something, that was owned at one point by somebody in my family. Kind of. So, anyway, so we take great pride in that. It's under renovation right now. We hope that it's
Be open.
we'll be able to go into it, which is just looking at the outside. But in that is also a little picture of a table and a chair where Schumann supposedly sat. Anyway. And Nuremberg, of course, is known for a bunch of different things. Albrecht Dürer, famous painter, sketch, mostly pencil sketching. Right?
No, he did.
Other painting as well.
Yeah, he did.
And Lebkuchen, which is a German gingerbread cookie for Christmas time. And there's very good sausages, of course. And then the trials have to go into the Nazi criminals. So we'll touch on these things along the way, as well as. And then if we go on the next slides, I have it's important to also look at.
Aren't you going to like the big famous beer house?
No, we're not. The one could do so many more things. And we started this trip with a 10-day trip, and it just kept getting longer. We had to keep adding things into it. But of course, so there's all of these beers, or most of these beers, are available in most parts of Germany, but these are kind of where they come from. I did print those out for you. I didn't want to waste the paper, but I thought it was a fun little addition as well. And then on the right-hand side of the map, you see where a lot of these craft breweries or breweries in general are. So lots of them in Germany, everywhere. And the most concentrated area of breweries is always where the Catholics are. Still today, a lot of monasteries, had breweries, had their own breweries, and monks were really good beer brewers. So
They're big into craft beer.
that's where they want to go. That's where they want to go. Exactly. The beer slide, which I didn't. We'll send you a link to the slide deck for those on Zoom. So I didn't print those out. I didn't think. And the next slide is a little culinary piece, just food specialties from around Germany. So lots of goodies. And the interesting part, of course, in Bavaria, the lower right, part of the food is a mug of beer. So there you go.
That's a food, isn't it?
Right, exactly. And then the next slide is also, another thing that Germans are famous for is their bread, of course. And so these are different words for what you call in these regions the end of a loaf of bread. So, the heel, there we go. So anyway, so different geographic kind of and dialects call it something different. So
Is there like a meaning behind that? Like that part of the bread was.
I don't know why,
How they,
but they, I mean, some of them have other meanings, some of the words. I love the bottom one, right? The end. So, which makes sense. A couple of them have other meanings, but very few I know of in other contexts.
Oh, there's crust.
There's a cost, right? Yeah.
and simple is another hidden meaning.
Simple mean, what does it mean in English?
Tip of something, isn't it?
What?
The top or tip of something.
A tip of, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Anyways, I thought it was kind of so fun.
But you can see how, okay, how important, just throwing it out there since I'm a language person, kind of throwing it out there, how different dialects, right, will have kind of different names. So this is why it was really important that Luther translated the New Testament into the German that he spoke, which kind of solidified and standardized the language. So there are all these possibilities, right? And he basically just translated so the people around him could understand it, and that has kind of rippled out, so that became what is now modern High German. So his influence on language is just really huge. And here's an example of why that was important, because how are we going to talk to each other? Right? Well, there you go.
So just a question. I remember from studying English that there was like Old English, Middle English, and then current sort of modern English. Did Germany have that same sort of transformation?
Yes. Yeah, there's Old High German, and then Middle High German, and now modern Standard High German. There were also though different areas of and so you can, if you go back far enough, you'll hear like Franconian or some different types of versions within the like Old High. They'll say this is Old High German, and it's kind of a group of languages. And basically English is a little bit similar like that. If you ever get a chance to read Chaucer and hear how he originally wrote it, it sounds a lot different. Or even Shakespeare. It can be kind of fun to, there are groups in England that will do Shakespeare in the pronunciation of the times, which is different than how we pronounce things today. So it's really, language is a really fun thing to play around with, and German had the same kind of process. There's Old High, but there are versions of Old High based on different regions. Old High German, and then there's also Low German or Plattdeutsch, which is another version of German today. People do speak Platt, especially up in the very far north.
I was just going to say, is the high and low geographic influence on the language, or is it just considered? Okay.
Yeah, it's more geographic. And then there were a lot of Germans that left, especially areas of what became Russia, that were German speakers that were in areas that belonged to Russia. So they left, they were kicked out actually and moved to North Dakota.
Yes.
So, and that language has kind of fossilized from the 19th century. So if you go to North Dakota, it's very English influenced. There are people that still speak just German in North Dakota, but they speak a dialect that's now kind of antiquated in Germany, because it's kind of fossilized in the middle of the 19th century. And then it's been influenced by English. So it's a really interesting version of German. Another area in the United States where German is spoken is Pennsylvania. And you've heard of Pennsylvania Dutch, which is Dutch at all. Yeah, it's
Deutsch.
German, it's Deutsch, and it is also from an even earlier version, 1700s. And that is also influenced by English somewhat. But yeah, those are two areas.
I'm in Fargo. Which part of North Dakota is that mixed German being spoken that you know of?
Toward the east, right? Over by
Okay, kind of from Bismarck, if you think of where Bismarck is, which is, I go south to the South Dakota border, and then east, maybe 100 miles, and then kind of angle back toward Bismarck again. That would roughly be the
Right.
German triangle, where the German immigrants, and those were mostly Russian.
right.
Russian.
German.
Russian.
Mostly Catholic too.
Well, there's a lot of Lutherans there too. Yeah, there's strong Lutheran churches there.
It was mixed, but it was very much of a thing that they were asked to leave in those Russian
Yes.
areas. So they were not given a lot of choice, and they came to North Dakota.
So every once in a while, a scholar will show up in North
Right.
Dakota
To be said.
wanting to study the ancient language of German.
Yeah.
Now, I think those dialects also go back to this idea of these small principality states,
Yeah.
right? Where people were just in this little enclave. and, over the next hill, they had a little different term, for things. And so, there's still, my mother still thinks, I grew up in near Stuttgart. She was born in Berlin and up by Hanover is where she spent most of her time growing up and studying and working before she came here. But, she claims that even before I, went to school, I had two languages, German and Schwäbisch, which is a dialect in the southern part, or around Stuttgart. Bavarian has its own dialect. And there are areas in Bavaria where, when I worked there for 6 months at one point, if the people at the lunch table at the factory where I worked, I was a plant manager, wanted to, they could talk amongst themselves without me having any idea what they're saying. Just such a deep dialect.
Dialect, yeah. But everybody speaks Hochdeutsch.
And they were very
understand
proud
it.
about that.
Yeah.
Because,
And so don't let them pretend like they don't understand high
They all
German.
understand.
They do.
And that's what they're learning in school,
Yeah.
speaking and spelling standpoint.
And that's what's on television and on the radio and stuff usually is High German, regular, standard High German, yeah.
And there's other strong dialects like that around Dresden in Eastern Germany, like the
Saxony.
area Sächsisch is really strong dialect as well. And, but each region, there's, not all these words for the end of a loaf of bread. It's just an indication of all, there's other words, of course, that differ from region to region. Right?
What would have been Martin Luther's like dialect or?
Well, he would be in the Air Force, so Sächsisch.
Sächsisch.
Yeah.
He's closest to Saxony, yeah. So, but now, of course, it's because it became accepted, so that area is, you understand it. The Saxony has kind of evolved a little differently. He was in Thuringia too, which is another
Right.
kind of area right there. You can kind of tell, and so that is sort of a little bit of a mixed dialect, but it became sort of what is standard German now.
So I, changing the subject a little bit, but I won't be going on the trip. I'm told. But the route is very much the one I took in 1990.
Okay.
And what I was going to suggest is, en route, somewhere in this, is Buchenwald.
Right. We talked about that
Yeah,
recently.
we talked about that once before, and that was not our trip, but when we learned about it, our travel party said, we want to change and
Right,
short
include that.
something else
Yeah.
and visit that because it's so historically
Right.
important.
What
Well, I
is?
So Buchenwald is one of the concentration camps.
Okay.
So,
I was there in 1990 and it was just with the tour group. I visited again in 2000, just with my family. And when I was there in 2000, not all of it was open because they were upgrading or refurbishing, making it more available for tourism.
Okay.
So that I think that it's still there today.
Yeah, it is. And from Leipzig on the way to Erfurt on that trip, we could stop there. Or, some people
I wouldn't want to go.
wouldn't see, Lisa doesn't want to go either. He says,
I mean,
feel like we know enough, we don't have to
Yeah.
be in that heavy spot. It is a heavy,
yeah.
Yeah, it is.
And I went to the museum in DC and then in
Right,
the Third
right.
Reich,
Yeah.
the Rise and Fall of the Third
So,
Reich.
so we can talk about it once we have
No,
to
but
get together
some people-
and decide. And, because it's not that far from Erfurt, we also could drop people off and then go back and kind of thing. So I've thought about that. And I think I went to Dachau once and I like going to those places by myself because I want to process by myself. I don't want necessarily to talk about it, right?
Yeah.
That's
Um,
true.
Is that the one that's near Munich?
That's
Dachau,
Dachau. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then, actually Buchenwald is also interesting because the Soviets after 1945, used it as a camp of sorts. And there were about 30,000 people
Are
that
we gonna
starved
be
there
in-
during that time.
30,000
30,000 in five
We're going to be in
years.
Munich, right?
We won't be in Munich
Okay.
itself, yeah. I know.
Well, because to my knowledge, that's the only place where there's a Holocaust museum within Germany. We happened to just find it.
Mhm.
It was connected to an art museum. It
Oh,
was very small, but
when were you there? So
Oh.
isn't there
I
something
don't
in
know.
Berlin? Is there not some museum?
Well, there's
a
basically
memorial.
there's stuff all over, but one that was just purely for the Holocaust, or the Shoah, or is I think that because they have different memorial spots all over pretty much, but if that's, I hadn't heard about that one
No, I
per se.
mean, maybe it was the local people because it was all about the mayor of the town, how he had been complicit.
Yeah, that could be.
Yeah.
In Berlin, they have now there's that really incredible sculpture thing that you were at, Mark, I think.
Yeah, it's right
I
next to the
haven't-
Brandenburg Gate, and it's this,
I haven't seen it yet.
it's
'cause
these huge
relatively-
blocks of concrete, different heights, but they're massive. And with paths in between, so you kind of walk in between, you kind of, as you walk more toward the middle, the blocks get bigger and tall, maybe not twice,
Very-
3 times as tall as we are. And so it becomes very impressive, very.
And it's a memorial site, and so there are different spots like that kind of throughout Germany. Germans have done a pretty good job of, it's part of their educational system, so they actually, kids in school are, learn about the Holocaust, and that it was their own country. And
But, in 1973, when I was in 7th grade roughly, that was the first time my high school actually had a lesson or lessons about World War II. So that's almost 30 years afterwards, right? 28 years after.
Well, there was a lot of focus on what the Cold War was happening in the Cold War.
We were discussing how could Hitler have come to power, those kind of things in the Holocaust.
So, yeah.
I had older brothers who hadn't gone through that.
That's very interesting. To know
I mean, there's so much more one,
Do, yeah.
but we're trying to focus on good.
that. Yeah.
Anything else from the Zoom room?